Welcome to Free Thoughts. I'm Aaron Powell.
And I'm Trevor Burrus.
Our guests today are Justin Tosi, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Texas Tech University, and Brandon Warmke, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Bowling Green State University. Their new book is Grandstanding, The Use and Abuse of Moral Talk. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Thanks, guys. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
What is grandstanding?
Well, if you wanted to kind of like the simplest bumper sticker description of grandstanding, grandstanding is the use of public discourse for self-promotion. Grandstanders engage in discussions about politics or morality to try to impress people with how good they are, to seek social status. And so, a bit more detailed, we give this account in the book that's a very simple account of grandstanding. It just has two parts. Grandstanders say something in public discourse. They make a claim about morality or politics or about themselves. And that's motivated, what they're saying. We call that what they say, the grandstanding expression. And that's motivated by a strong desire for moral recognition. We call this the recognition desire. And that desire could be all kinds of different things. You might have a general desire to just have people think well of you. You might have a specific desire for people to think that you care deeply about the poor or about family values. But whatever that desire is, it's motivating primarily what you say. So lots of our motivations are complex, but what grandstanders are really out for, what they really care about, is people coming away thinking that there's something morally special.
It seems weird to me because, on some level it's obvious, and I've thought about this before, that there's two choices, or there's two possibilities here where you can be moral, like whatever moral theory you have, you can be moral and you can seem moral. And those don't actually have to be the same thing. It might be true that what is the actual moral truth doesn't look moral to anyone else. And so you look like a bad guy, but you are being objectively a good guy. Or, of course, the inverse could be true. But it seems, not that surprising that people would want those things to line up, that they both seem to be moral and that they are doing moral. So is that bad to grandstand and try and portray that?
Well, so the thing about trying to come across as being a morally good person is that your behavior or what you say will shift in ways that you might not expect. So you might think, going into a conversation, look, I just have like this warehouse of things that I believe in my head, and they're talking about X, so I'll just go to the shelf with X on it and pull out my belief about X. But that's not quite how it works, actually. And in fact, if you're out to show people that you're good and maybe to stand out in your group, what you'll do is to subtly shift the substance of your view, or at least your expression of it, in order to seem especially good, or to make it really clear that you're good. So what you'll often see people doing is they will gradually adopt more and more extreme positions in a conversation. So they might engage in what we call ramping up. So they'll adopt a view or express a view that's a little bit more extreme maybe than the last person who spoke. And this is how we end up going in a matter of 48 hours from I think we should defund the police to abolish the police entirely, because people are trying to stand out as seeming especially against police brutality, for instance.
In moral theory, when we're assessing a moral agent, we can on the one hand assess their actions, that what's morally right or wrong is based on what they actually do in the world and the consequences or whatever other criteria we have. And on the other side, we might assess their motivations. And it seems like that grandstanding, this theory, sits somewhere in the middle or straddles them, because on the one hand, a lot of the negative things that you describe about it, the reasons that it's like we shouldn't be doing it, it's bad, the consequences of it are consequences. They're things that happen in the world and we shouldn't be doing that, and it's making the world worse and discourse worse and so on. But on the other hand, your definition of grandstanding depends deeply on like a subjective requirement that, I have to intend to grandstand. I am trying to use moral talk to promote myself instead of trying to use it for other more laudable things. Is that a tension? And how does that like subjective side of it mean that we should go about assessing grandstanding or recognizing it in the world if to really know it depends on like knowledge that exists only in the head of the actor?
Yeah, so I'll just say a few things about the moral argument. So over the course of 3 chapters in the book, we give kind of like a all hands on deck set of moral arguments against grandstanding, where the conclusion to all these arguments is that grandstanding is bad and should be avoided. So we have a chapter in which we argue that we think on balance, grandstanding has some pretty serious social consequences. It promotes polarization, cynicism about moral discourse. It causes outrage, exhaustion. And then we have a chapter in which we argue, setting aside the consequences, we think that grandstanding is just disrespectful. It free rides on other people's conscientious use of public discourse. It can be very deceitful. And also it's manipulative and coercive, conscripting people into your morality play to shame them and punish them. I mean, that's just not what morality is for. And then we have a chapter in which we argue for various reasons that a virtuous person wouldn't grandstand, that on traditional Aristotelian accounts, on virtue consequentialist accounts. And then we have a fun kind of section on Nietzsche where we argue that Nietzsche would even argue for virtue-based reasons that people shouldn't grandstand. So what should we make of all that? Well, compare grandstanding to lying. So lying is another activity, or bullshitting, or demagoguery, or bragging. Lots of these phenomena, discursive phenomena, are essentially defined by, at least in part, by what's in our head. So you don't lie just because you say something false. You lie because you intend or decide to mislead someone. And so grandstanding also has this, as you note, Aaron, this sort of mental aspect that's often not transparent to us. But no one would argue that lying is not wrong, and in fact worse than simply accidentally perhaps misleading someone. And so there's something sort of really bad about intentionally lying, that and lying has worse consequences than just saying something false, right? So you might lose trust, right? It's sort of disrespectful in a way that simply getting the facts wrong isn't. And so there's all these things that are bad about lying that are bad in virtue, not just of the consequences, but also bad about what someone's doing, what someone is trying to mislead or deceive. And so grandstanding in a way is very similar in this respect. Grandstanding is it's certainly a behavior. It's something we outwardly do, but it also has this interior mental element. And we think that explains further ways in which it's wrong. So throughout the book, if it's helpful to think about grandstanding along the lines of bullshitting or demagoguery or humble bragging, lying, these are all phenomena that have to essentially refer to mental states. Now, the point you make about knowing whether someone is grandstanding or not is a really nice one. And I think for us, and I think for a lot of people, when they first hear about grandstanding, it's a frustrating thing because a lot of people want to say, like, they read the book or they hear about the work and they think, okay, give me the test. Like, how do I know that I see grandstanding? And we go through in the book lots of ways that grandstanding appears, what it looks like, maybe some clues for how to determine it. But there's no foolproof test, just like there's no foolproof test for determining whether someone is lying or not. I mean, in controlled studies, humans are not much better than the flip of a coin at determining whether someone is lying to them. And so, for lots of reasons, we go into, it's probably not a good idea to just go around trying to identify grandstanding, even though it's bad behavior. We think that it's also just going to have bad consequences to go around trying to call people out. So we have some other solutions for how to solve grandstanding. Maybe we can talk about later, but you're absolutely right. The grandstanding is just not transparent. It's just not obvious that someone's doing it. Now there are some sort of like pretty obvious cases. We discuss a case of Harvey Weinstein in the book after he got caught, talking about how much he cares about women and so on. And that seems pretty transparent grandstanding. But in the main, it's a very difficult thing to discern. In a way, that's why grandstanding is such a quiet poison, because grandstanders are camouflaging themselves in this moral language, this moral talk. They're sort of treating discourse as a way to get what they really want, which is status and impressing other people, but they cloak it in this high-minded moral language that really does hide their true intentions, even if it is successful at getting people to really think they're morally among the angels.
It seems that grandstanding is sort of interestingly indexical. When you were discussing ramping up, I was thinking about my life as a professional libertarian and the fact that in different times in my life, I've been in situations where there were a bunch of libertarians in the room who broadly agreed on things, but sometimes you can get into a situation where they're each trying to be more libertarian than the next one. And I've always said that there's a famous story of Mises and Friedman and Hayek being at the Mount Pelerin Society. And I can't remember who it was, but at some point, I think Mises was the one who called them a bunch of socialists and walked out of the room because they thought roads or something were a good idea. And I've watched libertarians like become anarchists over the course of like a conversation, right? Just like you mentioned about police. It's like defund police, abolish police, right? We don't need anything. And I've always said it's like libertarianism is like the vegetarianism of politics, where there's no feasible upper limit on human superiority complexes. So vegetarians, then you have people who are vegans who hate on the vegetarians, and you have people who are going raw who hate on the vegans, and you can keep going down that line. But it does matter who you're around in some sense, who you are grandstanding to. And do like-minded people gathering together and perhaps only seeing each other's feeds on social media and stuff, is this exacerbating the problem to some extent because they're all grandstanding to each other about who's the best version of this moral person that they agree on would be a generally moral person?
Yeah, that's great. I think one of the biggest losses of everyone being in lockdown because of this pandemic is that there was no Libertarian Party convention for this election cycle. Some of those clips from the last one are pretty great.
We don't. Unfortunately, yes, that's the image of the party. I agree, it's entertaining. It's a little bit disheartening, though. But of course, Cato has nothing to do with the Libertarian Party.
No, of course. Right. So, but the point you make is a great one, right? Of course, it depends on who you're around, and this is one of the reasons that it's so difficult to detect grandstanding, because it's just so contextual. Right. So the things that people say in front of a group of libertarians would mean something very different if they said them with a very different audience. Right. So this is still more support for the idea that that it's not a good, there's just not going to be a foolproof test for detecting grandstanding. But let me focus also on something else that you said, Trevor, about people who are kind of like-minded getting together. And, it seems like they get in these moral arms races. They ramp up like we were saying earlier. And they end up with these really crazy views. So this is the driving force behind one of maybe the most concerning problem with grandstanding that Brandon and I talk about in the book. And that is that it induces, we think, a lot of political polarization. So the way this works is, you get people talking together about some issue, and maybe all of your libertarian friends and you might think, well, I'm a really like extreme believer in personal liberty, right? None of these people is more extreme than I am about these, this issue or whatever issue we're talking about.
That's Murray Rothbard we're just talking about right now.
Yes. Yeah. So then people start talking and you're like, oh, all right, well, man, these people actually are pretty out there. But still, I'm like, I'm as pure as it gets. Right. So if they're saying, things that are crazy to like the 5th degree, I've got to, I have to go to the 6th degree. Why not? Right. So this is why we think people end up in a lot of cases, adopting really extreme views, and especially when they get to talking with members of their in-group, because it's easier for them to subtly shift their view about some issue than it is for them to see themselves as maybe less morally pure than they thought about themselves going in.
Yeah. So one of the things we do in the book is we explain the psychological mechanisms that are at play here. So as it turns out, decades of research show that many people think that they're morally better than average. I mean, as they conceive of morality, they think that they're morally better than the average person. Um, Psychologists call this moral self-enhancement. It's a very strong and robust effect. But we also care about what other people think of us, and we engage in what psychologists call impression management. So often we want people to think of us the way that we think of us. So if I think of myself, for example, as caring deeply for the poor, or caring deeply about the non-aggression principle or something, then I want people to know it, right? I want people to believe those things about me. And one thing we know, we have some good evidence in what Cass Sunstein calls the law of group polarization. So if you get a group of like-minded people together and you have them deliberate, there's this thing called social comparison that happens. And because we think of ourselves largely in relation to how we perceive ourselves in relation to others, it's like I'm not funny in lots of areas of my life, but when I go home to my family, I'm like the funniest person there, right? So I think of myself as like really funny. So you might hang out with your friends, and you think you really care about liberty, and then you go to an event with a bunch of libertarians, and you're like, holy hell, like, these people really care about it. And so you get these like-minded people together, and there's a kind of social comparison. So Aaron says, I really think that we should have this policy, and he looks like he really cares about liberty. So I can either let him have pride of place, or I can try to one-up him. And because in order to preserve this view of myself to myself and to others, I have a choice to make. And often what people do is they get into these iterative discussions about some issue, and they come out more extreme than they were. And the problem is, of course, these things are happening in all different kinds of communities. They're happening on the right and the left. And so we have some empirical evidence for this too, is that grandstanding is actually causing political polarization. It's actually causing people to push further apart. And so the kind of dynamic, Trevor, that you have in mind is we think one of the most fundamental causes of polarization, at least as it occurs in conversations.
I want to follow up briefly on the empirical question, at the risk of taking us slightly off topic. In the book, you draw a lot, as you said, on empirical research, on specifically psychological studies, and you mentioned that you guys have started working on your own stuff in that area with another professor. And as I was reading it, I was wondering about the replication crisis and how, when you're doing empirically grounded, psychologically grounded philosophy, you think about or deal with that. And so for our listeners, this is just the idea that, especially in experimental psychology, there's been a growing recognition of a problem that a lot of these studies don't replicate. So if someone else runs the same study again, they either don't find as large of effects, or they don't find any effects. And so it calls into question some of the results. And so how do you approach that when you're building philosophical theories on top of psychological research?
Yeah, that's really important. When Justin and I went into the book, we wanted it to be an empirically supported and grounded book. But we were also very much aware of the replication crisis, as you described. Now, what we did was a few things. One, we tried to draw only from really well-established research paradigms and programs in personality and social psychology. We ran the book by 4 or 5 professional psychologists, empirical psychologists, and we ran them by people who really care about replication. And so we tried to vet the book by the best standards of personality and social psychology. The other thing we did was we didn't rely on any studies that we thought were bad. So we actually read the studies, and sometimes I'd want to put something in, and Justin would say, no, that's not a great study, or Josh Grubbs, our psychologist that we work with, would say, yeah, maybe steer clear away from that. I don't think we cite any studies that discuss priming. So a lot of the studies that haven't been replicated are priming studies. You give someone a stimulus and then you see how they respond in sort of surprising in sort of weird ways. We don't engage in any of that. All of our studies are pretty straightforward. All the data that we've collected ourselves is high quality data, YouGov data, demographically matched to the U.S. and huge numbers too. I mean, we've done, I think ourselves, our studies have included 6,000 participants. So now, look, all that being said, 100 years from now, 5 years from now, maybe some of this stuff is going to be shown to be problematic in various ways. But this is just part of the enterprise of trying to, especially for philosophers. I mean, I think philosophers have all these theories and often no data, and psychologists have all this data. And I mean, I think one problem that psychologists have had with the replication crisis, they have all this data and they don't have any good theories. They don't have a way to sort of coherently understand what's going on. And so this is sort of self-serving, but I think Justin and I think of ourselves as sort of like bringing these two crowds together and provide a theory that makes sense of all this data. And it's at the behest of the winds of time and what science ends up discovering. But I think Justin and I are both pretty confident right now that all of the research programs that we draw on are decades old, and as far as we can tell now, they've held up under pretty rich scrutiny.
Yeah, that's right. We have been just absurd. I think it's fair to say absurdly careful. Now, I mean, that will come back to bite me, I'm sure, when someone finds.
I wish you wouldn't say that. You shouldn't
have said that. Oh, well. So one further thing. I mean, look, we have no interest here in trying to sneak anything through. One other thing that we've done is, as far as I know, we are following all of the new practices for the open science framework. And our colleague, Brandon's colleague, Josh Grubbs, when he, before he runs any of these studies, he uploads, our hypotheses and plan analysis and all of the other things that people are doing now to the open science framework website. So, it's probably too much bravado to say we're calling our shots, but we're being really careful.
Now, it seems to a lot of people, I'm sure, that this is a good book for the times, given our grandstander in chief, maybe to some extent, but also a bunch of people. And during the crisis now and the protests, we're seeing this a lot. Do you guys think that this is different now, or are you just diagnosing something that maybe comes in the sine waves in American history or world history, and maybe we're at the top of one, or something changed?
It's so hard to know, Trevor, when you're in the middle of it, where you're at. Justin and I started writing about grandstanding in 2014. We went to grad school together at the University of Arizona, and I just remember vividly one night we were standing in a parking lot of a Mexican restaurant. Here come the nachos. This is an ongoing joke. In a very early podcast, Justin said I talk about nachos too much. So we were talking.
No, it's fine. It's totally acceptable.
It's not possible. Exactly. Thank you. So we had this. We just had this sort of like epiphany. We like being on social media. It just seemed like a lot of people were. The moral conversations they were having seemed to be very centered around themselves. A lot of I talk, a lot of me talk, a lot of look at me, kind of showy preening. And it struck us as something kind of new was going on. Now, looking back on that conversation in 2014, when we started writing the original paper, from now, it's like quaint. I mean, things have really changed, and I don't think they've changed, all things considered, for the better. I think one thing that's happened is that more and more people are online. I think the social, psychological, personality ingredients of grandstanding are sort of as fundamentally human as something could be. Like the drives for status, the drive to have other people think well of you. In lots of contexts of life, those are perfectly or mostly innocent desires to have, and even maybe desires to satisfy. But I think that the fact that these sort of very basic temptations and human drives have been unleashed in a way that I think in no time in human history could people have imagined? I mean, 100 years ago, to have a crowd of 100 people listen to what you'd say, you'd have to like own a newspaper or have a radio station or be a preacher or a politician or stand on the street corner. Now, I mean, like literally anyone with a phone and a Twitter account can talk to 100 people. And I think it's much easier to satisfy these desires. And I think it's much harder to avoid seeing other people grandstanding. Now, we don't have a grand theory about like the present moment. Like why are things so crazy right now? I mean, I think it's a very complex situation having to do with, maybe it's Trump, maybe it's COVID quarantine, maybe it's a lot of bottled up resentment. I mean, we don't really have a theory about that. But I think one thing you are seeing now is people using extremely easy access to a soapbox to satisfy very basic human desires and not restraining ourselves when doing so would actually promote healthier norms for public discourse.
Just to add, one thing about this, a lot of people, I think, I know a lot of people think this because since the very first thing Brandon and I did about this, people have been trying to conscript us into the culture wars and to make this either make this into
about the other side.
Yeah.
You wrote this about them, right? It's not about us; it's about them.
Right. Well, that or it's an attack on us. They would say.
Okay.
So a lot of people try to turn this into like an anti-left project, and it's just not. I mean, I don't even need to sort of claim just about our motives. I mean, if you think for 5 minutes or less about the history of how people have abused moral talk, I mean, it isn't like the left has just recently started doing this. Think back to the Iraq War. I mean, how many people were shut out of the public sphere because they were supposedly soft on terror? Or think about the moral majority in the 80s. No end of preening in that movement. Or think even back to the McCarthy days of anti-communism. No shortage of moral grandstanding there either. The other thing about this is one of the things we've been so glad, not at all surprised, but so glad to have revealed by our empirical work is that this is just not a partisan phenomenon. So, if you look at a graph of who is showing grandstanding tendencies, who admits to showing the profile of a grandstander according to our grandstanding scale that we developed with Josh Grubbs, it's like a U-shaped curve. Right? So it doesn't tell you anything to know that someone's liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican. It doesn't tell you whether they're more or less likely to be a grandstander because it's a problem on both sides. What it does show, however, is that people who have more extreme views are more likely to engage in grandstanding. We think probably because those are the people who are most keen to show that they share the values of their group and maybe even stand out within their group as being the most committed to its values.
As I was reading the book, and you have the section where you talk about the 5 types of grandstanding, I was struck that most of them, so probably piling on, ramping up, trumping up, and displays of strong emotion at least, fit into hyperbole. And that it seems like our culture has, cultural discourse shifts and like the way that people speak shift. And we can go from like periods of ironic understatement to periods of lots of hyperbole, which seems to be what we're in now. And it's not just in moral, but it's in, headline writing is like, 5 things every 90s kid will remember and number 6 will drive you insane. or like reaction videos on YouTube where someone watches a movie trailer and just loses it.
Yeah.
And so hyperbole seems to be like the coin of the realm at this point, in not necessarily a moral way, but just in like, that's how we express ourselves. And so is there potentially a relationship to that grandstanding is maybe, or for a lot of people, not this kind of malicious or deceitful thing, but simply bringing the language of hyperbole into moral talk, like overstating for dramatic effect?
Yeah. So let's think about like what hyperbole does. How does hyperbole function or exaggeration? One of the things that we would argue is that hyperbole and exaggeration, which you're absolutely right, that a lot of grandstanding is hyperbole and exaggeration. One reason grandstanders use it is because it's a way to get attention. This is the most egregious violation of protocol ever. Like, we've never had a president do this, or you won't believe what the other side did. Like, this is the way to get attention. And so if if one thing that you're after is status, attention, people looking at you, people thinking that you are a high prestige sort of moral exemplar, then one way to get that attention, to stand out, is simply to be more extreme, to be more hyperbolic than everyone else. And so, there may be, I guess I could imagine someone who engages in a hyperbole or exaggeration merely as a kind of instrument to draw attention to what they're saying. So that the thought would be something like, not all cases of exaggeration or hyperbole or grandstanding, but the thought would be something like, hyperbole and exaggeration are tools in the grandstander's trade. It's a way to stand out. It's a way to make yourself look, say, for example, more incensed than everyone else about this. I remember Obama. We give a couple examples in the book. One of, Obama wore a tan suit once to a press conference when he discussed the Islamic State, and he just got pummeled by the right. And then he also
that was one of the stupidest moments in politics. That's a lot.
Yeah. And then he also, I think he was exiting Marine One once, and he like a coffee, like a Starbucks cup in his hand.
He saluted with coffee in his hand.
He saluted a Marine with coffee in his hand, which, it turns out that is a minor breach of protocol. But Karl Rove lost his mind. Breitbart was all over it, right? So here's one thing that could be going on here. So this is clearly exaggeration in hyperbole. I mean, but what's Karl Rove doing? Well, one thing he could be doing is saying, look, no one cares more about presidential decorum than this guy, right? That I care more. I mean, I am so incensed by this. And we know from empirical research that outrage is a reliable signal of moral conviction. I mean, it seems pretty obvious, but the more outraged you get, the more convicted you are about this moral issue. And so if Karl Rove is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe Obama did this thing, then one thing he could be doing is trying to draw attention to himself as someone who has a very sensitive moral compass. Of course, there are lots of other things he could be doing. I mean, it could just be a cynical ploy to attack the president. Maybe that's more likely. I don't know. But it's certainly true that one thing grandstanders do is exaggerate, use hyperbole, excessive emotions to try to draw attention to themselves. You got to stand out somehow.
Yeah, I really like this thought. I just want to note, so some people have looked at our stuff and they think, well, all grandstanding is hyperbole, right? So maybe it's even just part of the concept that you must be, exaggerating some moral reaction or something like that in order to be grandstanding. I don't think that you were suggesting this, Aaron, but just to nip this confusion in the bud, we think that's not right. And if you think about this, I mean, so take an example that we talk about in the book. Of Harvey Weinstein, writing this letter about how he respects women. He doesn't really say anything hyperbolic in the letter. He just says, "Yeah, I'm going to go after Donald Trump now. I'm going to go after the NRA, starting this foundation for women, and so on and so forth." And all of this is I think, pretty transparently, and I think most people who've read this letter had the negative reaction that this is very transparent. It's just a transparent ploy to get people to think better of him. But there's no hyperbole in it, and yet it's still grandstanding because he's using his supposed moral commitments in order to look good, in order to raise his status or to repair his public image.
I liked Aaron's idea that hyperbole is the coin of the realm, but I agree it's not just hyperbole, and a lot of this had me thinking about fandom. So we do have a kind of a new world of fandom and conventions and being a fan of certain genres or certain properties, Star Wars, Pokemon, whatever. And I think you see something like grandstanding, but it's not moral talk when you're trying to prove that you're the biggest fan of something. And it also reminded me of a few years ago, I read a book called Confederates in the Attic, which part of that book gets into the Civil War reenactor subculture, which is basically cosplaying for Civil War reenactors, kind of. But like they are deeply interested in one-upping each other on who is the most extreme Civil War reenactor. So there's, if you have to wear, wool clothing in July and August, because that's what the actual soldiers wore. If you break a foot, you should march on it because that's what you would have had to do in the war. Those are the hardcore people. So maybe all we're really seeing here is just the expected outcome, where we've seen in other things that are not political or moral, but the expected outcome of grouping together better that we're able to do now, which is related to a previous question, but I think it's bigger than just politics.
Yeah, you can bet if there's if in some social circle or community there's a desirable trait, you can pretty much make a sure bet that people will try to outdo each other to exemplify or express that trait. I mean, so you can think of like there's a kind of like intellectual grandstanding, bragging about, you've probably been at dinner with a know-it-all, and it's just really exhausting and annoying. People who, at dinner brag about how much money they make, people who grew up in religious backgrounds, there's a lot of spiritual sort of religious grandstanding. And so I think this is, you're right. This is just grist for our mill, that there are these basic fundamental human desires. And it turns out that morality is no different. I mean, one of our frustrations is that people seem to think that they have a very, well, we would say a very naive view about morality, about moral talk, that like people are like real selfish in like lots of other areas. So this is maybe grist for the libertarians mill, right? So, people say like people are too selfish to like give to charity and do things on their own. They need the government to come in and like do these things. So people are really selfish. But then they have this view that like when we're discussing morality, like all that goes away. Like all of our desires to promote ourselves and protect ourselves, like all those things go away, and like it's some sort of like magic moral realm where people are just talking about their sincere, morally held beliefs out of morally pure motives, and we just think that's just naive. I mean, it's just not a realistic way to understand what people are doing. I mean, ideally that would be the case, but it's pretty clear that what's going on. I mean, no one really thinks that someone deserves a death threat for like a minor internet faux pas. I mean, that's not, you can't really think that that's like these people are like really trying to figure out the moral truth here. That just can't be what's going on. So yeah, I mean, if humans are sort of like a mixed bag, morally speaking, maybe best case scenario, we're all sort of a mixed bag, we should absolutely expect in contexts where we're discussing morality and politics for people to engage in it for motives that are not, all that laudable.
Yeah, I like this thought a lot and this comparison a lot, Trevor. I mean, so, we read a bunch of social psychology for this book, and one of the things that emerges so clearly is that people are just so desperate to belong. One of the worst things that can happen to you is to just have no social group. I say being very alone in West Texas. So I mean, why do people all have to have all of the Funko Pop toys to like prove they're the biggest dork, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so,
Oh, I feel so attacked right now.
Yeah, yeah. Don't go to Brandon's house. Yeah, I mean,
fan culture is pretty poisonous. Yeah.
So there's this great. I think this might be my favorite thing that we found for the book is this thing called the black sheep effect. So what the literature says basically is like the worst thing that you can be is an unreliable member of your group. So if you're like a Civil War reenactor who's like not really into like like I saw that guy wearing like a normal belt once.
He was wearing Nikes.
Yeah,
on
right.
the battlefield. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, you'd be kicked out immediately. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So like, so people of course think the best of like the very strongly committed members of their group. They can see something that's at least like principled about the out group or like strongly in the out group. And then like the people who are kind of in the out group, they work with you sometimes. It's like, okay, well at least they're useful, But then the people who are not really, all the way in your group, you're like, what a jerk. Like,
they're traitors.
What side is he on? Right? Like, what does he think he's doing? Like he only has one Funko Pop, right? Think of like John McCain is a good figure for seeing this. Like he probably had higher status at most points in his career in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party, because he was kind of the black sheep of the Republican Party. So, I think people kind of know this. They know they don't want to be seen as sort of like someone people can't count on. And so they kind of overdo it with morality, just like they do with fandom or being a member of a political party.
You guys dedicate an entire chapter to grandstanding in politics. And, while we may point out that there's grandstanding in the non-political spheres, whether that's fandom or Civil War reenactment or whatever else, it does seem, I bet, that if you asked people, where they see the most grandstanding or name the biggest grandstanders, it's going to be either in politics or grandstanding about politics. And I wondered about that relationship and kind of the line of causation or the direction of causation. That do we have a tendency to grandstand more about political issues, or is it that the issues that we tend to grandstand a lot about become politicized?
So Tyler Cowen, maybe this is what you're thinking of. Tyler Cowen, who many of your listeners are probably familiar with, had this.
Oh yeah, he's been on the show.
Oh yeah, I mean, he's terrific. I've learned so much from him. He had this nice post about child abuse. So why isn't child abuse more of a political issue? Well, I mean, so one thing is like kids don't vote, but maybe
that's all what QAnon is about, though. So
is it?
Yeah,
so
that is
a lot going
disturbing
on.
Point. Yeah, a lot going on. But that is yes, okay. But we take your point. Yes.
Well, so people don't really. It's not like a live political issue, and people don't really grandstand about it that much. I mean, I'm sure if you go to I'm sure there are Facebook like child abuse communities, and people will try to outdo each other there. But most politicians don't really talk about it. So I guess this points to your direction of causation question. I guess I tend to think we go where the status is, right? And there's not much status to be gained from bashing child molesters. There's probably more status to be gained, more reputation to be made for going after people who are on the wrong side of some hot button political issue. Now, I guess you could, invent a wedge issue, and so everything has to be new eventually. But it's probably more work to find something new to grandstand about in politics, at least, than it is to just pick an existing issue and get a good line in there.
I suspect that people grandstand much more frequently about wedge issues. So when there's another side of considerable size who disagrees with you about it, and so the idea there is there is an outgroup. There's a clear, definable outgroup that you can show that you're better than. And there's also a power struggle, right? There's a kind of struggle within a group, for power of that group, and so my suspicion, and this would have to be, this is obviously an empirical question, is that the more something is a wedge issue, the more something is something that could be a talking point, say between political parties, you're going to find more grandstanding. And that just has to do with the incentives. It just has to do with the mechanisms that explain why people engage in status-seeking behavior. I do think that another issue, this sort of goes to Robert Talise's work on overdoing democracy. I do think that politics has just taken over more areas of our life. I mean, 30, 40 years ago, there's just lots of areas of life that I think were not as politicized as they are now. I mean, what kind of food you eat, what kind of car you drive, how big of a house you have,
plastic straws,
what neighborhood you live in, what what did the neighborhood that you lived in used to look like 50 years ago? I mean, there's just lots of moralized. I think it's pretty clear that lots of things have been moralized and politicized that weren't previously. And so there's a kind of creeping politicization of these things that. So we have to protect them, right? We have to, once you make, how big your yard is or what neighborhood you live in a political issue, well, you have to be prepared to defend it. So I think it's a really complicated. There's got to be some really complicated story here. I don't have a clear answer to this question, to Aaron's really nice question, but I think those two things, that you grandstand more about wedge issues, and that there has been a clear increasing politicizing of lots of areas of life.
So I think that a lot of people listening to this or reading your book would say, yeah, man, those people grandstand all the time. And it's very hard to tell someone that they're grandstanding and have them listen to you. It's kind of like telling someone that they're brainwashed. Like, no one ever says, I am brainwashed, right? Like, it's only an epithet. And so in this, like, one of the lessons should be, look in the mirror first. Think about those times that you might have been grandstanding, of which I can remember personally many times. I think I
have personally never done it, especially not on Twitter.
And I'm disgusted, and I'm personally disgusted and offended that I'm on the line with some people who have. I just want to.
I am more disgusted and offended. Are you kidding me?
Okay. Well,
Well, I want to take another line on this, and I think if Aaron cared more about morality, he would have erred more on the side of grandstanding.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You don't care enough about morality, Aaron, which is
right.
so. But I mean, yeah. So diagnose yourself, but it seems limited utility to diagnose others with this problem.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of goes back to Aaron's first question. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have, the last chapter in the book is what to do about grandstanding. And this is in many ways the hardest chapter to write. I think Justin and I by disposition are not all that inclined to tell people exactly how to live their lives or what to do. And I also think giving people advice about grandstanding is fraught with all kinds of partisan traps. I mean, people take our advice as like, well, you're picking on the left or picking on the right. So here's what we do say in that last chapter very briefly. I mean, we argue that you're absolutely right that calling people out for grandstanding is probably not a good idea. I think for most people, their first response when they hear about grandstanding is like, all right, tell me who's doing it, and I'm going to call them out. And we think that for several reasons, this is just not the right way to do. This is not the right way to to address grandstanding. One, it's really hard to tell when someone's doing it, and so two, it's unfair to make a public accusation when you're just not sure. And then three, it's just practically, it's just not it's not workable practically. I mean, I accuse you of grandstanding, and then like you accuse me of grandstanding, and then we get an argument about what's in my heart and what's in your heart. And the first time, that's just not a way to have a productive conversation. So what do? Well, we draw on some work here from Christina Bicchieri, a philosopher at University of Pennsylvania, and the idea is that we need to change norms. So we have this bad norm that's taken hold in some online circles, political circles, where grandstanding is common and it's rewarded. And we want to get to a new norm where grandstanding is uncommon, it's sort of embarrassing to engage in, and people aren't inclined to do it. They're able to restrain themselves in public discourse. So how do we change those norms? And it's really a three-step process. I mean, one step is to convince ourselves that grandstanding is wrong, and then set a good example in public discourse. So instead of engaging in public discourse and making it about me, make it about the evidence, make it about the data, make it about things that don't have to do with raising my status. So one thing is to set a good example, admit when you're wrong, be harder on ourselves than we are on others. I think most of us, we tend to be very gentle with ourselves and forgiving of ourselves, and we're very hard on others. And I think morality demands a kind of division of labor where we're easy on others, or at least we're harder on ourselves than we are than others. And then also, just redirect our desire for recognition in other ways. I mean, I think this is a very basic human desire, the desire for status, to impress other people. The problem is when we engage in moral discourse to satisfy those desires, we end up with cheap talk, and we cause polarization and lots of interpersonal conflict. one thing we say in the book is just to redirect that desire. So if you really want clout for doing something morally good, well, maybe go out to a soup kitchen or something and like do something actually good for people and then take a photo of it and post it on Twitter. I mean, you might be getting some recognition for that, but at least in the process, you will be doing something good. And then the last thing we argue in that chapter is that, we do need to try to figure out some social mechanism for disincentivizing grandstanding. And what we settle on is to try to make grandstanding embarrassing. So when there's something that you think might be grandstanding or is likely grandstanding, just ignore it. Don't reward people for their selfless, stands that everyone praises them for being so brave. I mean, imagine writing a long Facebook post about how, this little thing, like, offends your moral sensibilities, and then no one replies, no one likes it. That's, for most of us, embarrassing. And so it's a more subtle way of changing norms without going around and scolding people for grandstanding.
We should stress, one other thing about this, though, and that is, we don't want anyone to take this book as sending the message that you just shouldn't engage in moral talk. Right? The point of this book is that moral talk is really important, and it's a resource we need to protect, but it's also a resource we need to use. So, we have this test that we apply at a couple of points in the book, and I think people can use this day to day. And that is, when you're about to contribute something to public moral discourse, ask yourself, if it turned out that no one was actually impressed with me because of the thing I'm about to say, so that I got nothing out of saying this, would I be disappointed? And if the answer is yes, then we think you should probably be worried, right? You should worry that you're engaging in grandstanding. But if you think, upon reflection that, no, that this is just worth saying, period, and, even if nobody notices, nobody cares about me at all, I should say it, then you should say it, because you're not grandstanding.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy Free Thoughts, make sure to rate and review us in Apple Podcasts or in your favorite podcast app. Free Thoughts is produced by Landry Ayers. If you'd like to learn more about libertarianism, visit us on the web at www.libertarianism.org.